You're an agribusiness executive navigating an increasingly competitive market while trying to grow your company. Mergers and acquisitions are pitched as an accelerant to growth, but many M&A deals destroy more value than they create. Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches for successful mergers and acquisitions. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod. I'm your host, Joe Mosier. Thank you as always for choosing to spend your time with us today. Today we've got a great interview for you guys. I am speaking with Tyler Hull. Tyler is the president of AgriCapture, which is a Nashville-based agricultural technology company that's using on-farm data and remote sensing technologies to monitor, report, and certify climate-friendly commodities and to help generate carbon credits. And they're one of the few companies, one of the precious few in history that's been able to successfully issue carbon credits under the Climate Action Reserve's Soil Enrichment Protocol. So very excited to have this time to spend with Tyler. It's a little bit of a different take than we typically have in terms of the companies that we have on, the leaders that we have on that we profile. A few things that you're going to hear that I think are really interesting and relevant to the work that we're all doing across agribusiness is Tyler's going to talk to us about what it's like to operate in a really technically complex space, which is also emerging. And the environment where they operate is fascinating because it's at the intersection of things like government regulation that's looking to support regenerative ag and regenerative practices. They also have increasing and emerging regulation and regulator scrutiny, monitoring and verifying environmental claims that companies are making, looking at the technical challenge of just collecting and verifying, quantifying, and certifying good quality data off the farm relative to agricultural production and the practices that helped support it. And at the same time, helping educate both the ag producers who are participating in the market, as well as industry participants and the consumers that are looking to invest in this and looking to make buying decisions and purchasing decisions based on the environmental profile, environmental claims of the products. And so the needing to establish the credibility and have good, valid processes in place and navigate all these emerging changes and something that's already technically complex is a really good profile, I think, as we think about executing strategy in ag supply chain. And Tyler's not only going to explain what they are focusing on and talk to us about, why rice, for example, has such an outsized opportunity in terms of reducing methane emissions and improving water utilization. But he's also going to break down for us all the technical aspects of this, carbon offsets, insets, the different monetization strategies that are available to farms and farmers. And as you'll hear, he really knows his stuff, and it's easy to listen to him and learn a lot along the way. And he's also going to speak authoritatively on the real challenges farmers and AgriCapture are facing every day, along with the very real upside that he sees for further value creation as we get to wider adoption and the marketplace earns credibility and social proof. So I'm really excited about this. And with that, let's get into the interview. Tyler, good to have you on the show today. Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod.
Thanks for having me. Excited.
Yeah, likewise. We have not had someone on the program yet that is doing what you do, that has the deep technical knowledge and an emerging part of the ag value chain, and something that has potentially the opportunity to help monetize good practices and good behaviors among our farmers and ag producers. And so really looking forward to this discussion and digging in. To do that, let's just start off with who is AgriCapture? Kind of what is the AgriCapture 101? And share with our listeners an overview of what you all do, kind of where you play, because I think that helps us get grounded in how you see the world and where you're competing.
Yeah, sure. So AgriCapture is a Nashville-based agricultural technology firm. So we work with primarily row crop farmers throughout the Mid-South to quantify the environmental impacts of their farming practices. So we do that through field data, satellite imagery, remote sensing, and we quantify those outcomes to monetize and add revenue streams to the farm. So there's a variety of emerging ways to do that: carbon offsets, carbon insets, and then value-added commodities. But we kind of operate across the gambit of taking field data and turning it into an asset in the form of a new revenue stream for the farmer.
Interesting. And when you say the farmer, what are you working with? Sort of conventional row crop? Are you in the specialty space? Is it veg? Kind of where are you guys focused these days?
Yes, our bread and butter is in rice. That's our primary crop of focus for a whole host of reasons. I'd be happy to take you down the rabbit hole, but we also operate in corn, soybeans, cotton, and then native grasslands as well. And then we actually have some pilot projects in the more specialty crop category, chickpeas, lentils, and otherwise. So really kind of have a widespread approach looking to create value throughout the agricultural production systems.
Very good. Well, yeah, take us down the rabbit hole. So rice is not an insignificant commodity, an agricultural product of the United States, but it may not on its surface, given the relatively low percentage compared to other major commodities, might not seem like the most logical place to dig in first. So what's the story with rice?
Yeah, rice is just such an interesting crop. So rice, unlike most crops, is grown in a flooded environment. So rice is a massive water thirsty crop, the way that it's grown. And then also the flooded rice field creates an anaerobic environment for the soil and for a lot of complex scientific reasons. Basically, that causes the soil to emit methane when it's flooded. So we focus on rice because it has a tremendous opportunity to reduce water consumption and also reduce methane emissions. And so if you think about our business as monetizing environmental impact, rice is the greatest opportunity to do so because it starts from a place of high water use and high methane emissions.
Interesting. Yeah. So I think I've revealed my own ignorance here on exactly what's the rubric when you go into choosing the commodity that you focus on. So your counterparties that you're working with are these small scale farmers, typically larger operations. Kind of tell us who your target market is and who you're working with.
Yeah. So we work with smaller farmers, larger farmers. Mills are a big part of the supply chain. So kind of the 30,000 foot view is we work with farmers to implement more sustainable rice irrigation practices. So basically practices that reduce water use and thereby reduce associated methane emissions. And then we have mills that segregate that rice from farm to segregated storage bin through the milling process and then on to consumers. So, we have consumer packaged good products coming out with climate friendly rice. You can think of it very similar to organic markets, right? Organic communicates to the consumer the way the crop was grown. It's not commingled through the supply chain, and then it reaches the consumer and is signified through, the USDA organic seal, which you're familiar with. So that kind of has a full integrated supply chain approach, including farmers, mills, processing and packaging facilities, and then retailers. So that's kind of one side of the equation. And then also for the farmers that are maybe going into more traditional commodity or export markets that aren't necessarily going to tap into the value-added premium market, that's where we quantify that environmental impact data and then monetize a carbon offset or inset. So it doesn't require the same segregation and identity preservation from the field, but still takes that water reduction or that methane reduction and creates a new revenue stream from it.
Interesting. Okay. So on the topic of the climate-friendly rice that you just talked about, and so this kind of being a CPG or a consumer-facing product directly, if I understand correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong there, but is AgriCapture and folks like yourselves that might be doing something similar, are you creating the market that enables a concept like climate-friendly rice, or was the market there and you're actually feeding the growth of it? I'm wondering kind of on the supply-demand side, where you would put the work that you all do, either creating the demand via the supply or responding to it.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we started AgriCapture in 2021, and I told people I was working in regenerative agriculture, people just kind of blinked their eyes and didn't know what I was talking about. Now in 2024, when I talk to somebody and I tell them about, I'm working in regenerative agriculture, they're like, oh, tell me about, soil carbon, water use. It starts to click a little bit. And so we're seeing it's consumer demand pulling through the supply chain. Organic has been an indicator that there's a price differentiation based on the way a crop is grown. I think we're going to see a lot more of that. But as consumers become more aware of things like soil health, methane and N2O emissions, water use, the differentiation is not just conventional or organic, but it's kind of more particular to the on-farm practices. So our role in that is to be an independent, verify, quantify, and certify the on-farm practices. So we believe that there is a consumer willingness to pay for crops that are grown sustainably, and that there are farmers willing to implement those practices, but the disconnect is in the data to prove that they're happening, and then that certification to consumers to verify it. And so I think, where we've seen, the disconnect to date is that for a market to really develop around regenerative agricultural systems or crops, you have to really trust what you're buying. It can't just be kind of a tagline that's not founded in data. Otherwise, the CPG or the retailer is really creating a liability for themselves in the form of greenwashing, rather than creating an asset for themselves in the form of a marketing benefit.
So that you're taking us exactly where I was hoping to go here, which is going to talk about the challenges in this kind of an emerging marketplace, right? In every growing or emerging or evolving market, it's always rich with opportunities, but it's also equally burdened with all sorts of novel challenges. Some are more exciting than others to work through. But right before we go there, let's go through a couple basic term definitions. So at the top of the show, you had talked about carbon offsets, carbon insets, value-added commodities. Kind of walk us through a couple of those core terms, because I think that'll be helpful then as we kind of dig in a bit further.
Yeah, Joe. So we'll pretend you're a rice farmer, right? You are growing your rice. You're using alternate wetting and drying. You're effectively applying your nitrogen. You're doing a lot of the best practices. And then you have a reduction in your greenhouse gas emissions and water use. We view it as you have one of three options. You can take that reduction and sell it as a carbon offset. So that's outside of the value chain. That's to your Microsofts, your Shells, your Fortune 100 companies that are looking to offset their emissions. You could sell it as an inset, so downstream to your end buyer, whether it be a Unilever or a Mars or otherwise. You could pass that environmental impact to your downstream company that's sourcing your rice, or you can retain that environmental impact and market your crop on the basis of it. So not selling an offset, not selling an inset, but actually going through the supply chain to retail your sustainably produced rice. We call that climate-friendly rice. And so therein lies kind of the three options and kind of the different monetization strategies for each.
Interesting. Okay. So when I think about this, or the arc of the years we've spent talking about creating a carbon market, for example, and this is not exclusively to ag. I mean, this happens in petrochemicals and a variety of other areas. And as you said, in the offset space, there's lots of folks that do want to buy these carbon offsets as a way to sort of, I guess, being cynical, you could say that it allows them to continue with some of their traditional practices, right? But they pay the penalty or pay the price. They buy the offset, they buy the credit, and it effectively offsets something that they're already doing. And I know that there's always been this concern around the proper accounting and reconciliation of credits. How do you ensure that credits aren't being double sold? How do you ensure that they're verifiable, that they're actually there, and then that they're only being sold once? How do you make sure that they're not being, you don't have multiple people along a value chain pointing to them as part of the sustainability of their product and sort of disproportionately or sort of, let's say, exaggerating the overall impact, the positive impact of it. So kind of, how do you guys face these challenges? And I'm guessing there's other challenges with permanence and additionality, et cetera. Sort of what are the primary challenges, I guess, is the question I'm looking to ask. And how do you help navigate around those?
Yeah, addressing all the problems in the carbon market and challenges is a loaded question. Let me do my best to articulate all of the nuances there. So if you're a company looking to offset your carbon footprint, you want to be financing a new practice, right? If you're just paying somebody for something you're doing, those dollars aren't driving impact. So that is where the concept of additionality comes from. An independent company looking to offset their carbon footprint wants to pay a farmer to implement a practice they weren't already doing to reduce their emissions or to sequester carbon. So additionality is rooted in the concept of doing a new practice and being financed to implement that practice by someone else who wants to offset their carbon footprint. Similarly, companies that are sourcing agricultural products want to know the carbon emissions associated with that. So irrespective of when they adopted the practice, they want to know what the greenhouse gas emissions are associated with the way that it was grown. That kind of rolls up as your scope 3 emissions, or the emissions associated with the commodities that you source. And then as you work with your suppliers and supplying producers to implement practices that reduce emissions, you effectively inset. It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek term, right? And you're insetting within your own supply chain. You're working with your own suppliers to do new practices, adopt irrigation and tillage and cover cropping techniques that are going to reduce your scope 3 emissions and therefore inset your own supply chain. And so offsets are predicated on there needs to be a new practice. Insets can be achieved by sourcing from a different supply shed that has lower emissions, or actively working with your producers to adopt new practices and inset your own scope 3 emissions. A lot of buzzwords there, a lot of complexities, but that's it kind of at the high level.
Is it fair to also say that, is permanence and understanding the shelf life of a sequestered ton of carbon? Is that part of the process, as well as verifying that not only was that sequestered, and not only was that either a new practice or a legacy practice, whether it's an offset or an inset, but then what is the requirements around how long it has to actually be sequestered? How does that kind of work through the process as well?
Yeah, so largely carbon markets are predicated on 100 years of permanence. So if you add carbon to your soil and sell a carbon credit, you're somewhat obligated to maintain that carbon in the soil to uphold your credit. Otherwise, you've had what's called a reversal. So therein lies the challenge in an active row crop agricultural system to ensure 100 years of permanence. Taking you back down the rabbit hole, that's why we're keenly focused on rice, because rice has a huge opportunity to emit less. It's not necessarily an effort to increase soil carbon, because frankly, it's really challenging to ensure 100 years of permanence. If you get a wet fall, you're going to have to till your field. You have generations that will operate that land over the next 100 years. Frankly, there is not a good way, in my opinion, to ensure 100-year permanence of soil carbon removals, which is why emission reductions, meaning emitting less year over year by the way that you apply fertilizer or irrigate your land to reduce methane emissions, doesn't have that very complex 100-year permanence issue associated with it. So yeah, additionality is essentially doing something new. And then permanence is carbon markets are typically predicated on if you remove carbon, it has to be removed for 100 years. And otherwise, there's a reversal and effectively that credit is in default. So another reason why we believe emission reductions are very robust and more realistic for an active row crop agricultural system.
Yeah, this just feels like an incredibly complex environment to be operating in, and to be at the leading edge of trying to source or figure out the solutions. So rather than just the bear case all afternoon here, only asking what the problems are, let's talk about the opportunities. So on the flip side, what are some of the opportunities that you guys at AgriCapture have been able to, let's say, incentivize to build the business, despite maybe you call them barriers, maybe you just call them complexities to manage? But how have what are the opportunities you see to kind of move past these sort of all the reasons to say no and actually get excited about saying yes?
Yeah, well, I would say first and foremost is this is moving from a concept of, hey, what if there was a financial instrument called a carbon credit and it could create value? And it was more of an ethereal concept to AgriCapture has been issued carbon credits. We have sold carbon credits. There are real dollars associated with this. And so I think as these financial incentives become reality, which I think a lot of farmers haven't seen thus far, there's been a lot of talk about this opportunity to think about operating your land in the context of carbon payments. Now that those have come to fruition and are real, I think it brings a lot more interest and opportunities into the fold. And so one way that that's happening is the USDA has put a significant investment into climate smart commodities. So AgriCapture received a $7.5 million grant from the USDA for our work in rice to create a market. So that allows us to pay farmers upfront to implement these practices. And then on the back end, we can capture the data, quantify the impacts, and robustly certify the emission reductions and the water savings associated with those practices. It effectively allows us to create a supply of climate-friendly rice, which is really exciting. So that's one way, that's one opportunity that's real and presently available to farmers. If you're a rice farmer out there, we're enrolling 35,000 acres this calendar year of 2024. It's the second year of our program. So that's on one side. And then on the other side is if you implement practices, you are creating environmental value. If you are changing the way that you irrigate, if you're changing the way that you manage your tillage, if you're changing the way that you apply fertilizer, that is a value-added product. And one way to extract that value is through offsetting or insetting, which basically means good data to prove what happened and quantify the outcome. So really, it's an exciting time right now, I believe, because the influences are not just price, yield, and cost. Those are certainly still the primary drivers, price of what you're growing, yield, and cost. But now there's this other financial incentive, which is also looking at, are you sequestering more or emitting less? And what's the dollar value associated with that? And that's a new signal that's coming into the agricultural industry, which is really exciting.
So a couple of questions there. And the first point where you talked about you made a comment that the USDA grant that AgriCapture receives allows you to pay the farmers upfront. And so that was stated as a benefit. So I'm going to assume then that absent that grant requires that the farmers are being paid on the back end, so to speak. What does that actually look like? What sort of a time horizon would a farmer typically be looking at from the moment of implementing different, better regenerative practices? And I'm saying different and better in the context of regenerative ag. I know there's some dispute around what different or better might be, so I'll name that. But are we talking that they're getting paid weeks earlier, months earlier, years earlier? Sort of what's the schedule issue that kind of a grant or that kind of support will solve for?
Yeah. So for example, in this year in 2024, we could pay upfront for Joe to implement alternate wetting and drying in a rice field, a practice that may be new to you, requires more active management of your irrigation. So paying you to be able to put together the irrigation infrastructure and the plan to actually implement this practice, we then quantify the water savings, the emission reductions associated with that. And then excitingly, we have a partnership with Columbia Grain International that is sourcing this rice at a premium. So a market-driven premium to you on the bushel of rice. And then they are packaging it and retailing it to the consumer at a premium relative to conventional as well. So you can see the consumer willingness to pay and the farmer willingness to adopt meet in the middle through the added benefit of this upfront incentive. But then the outcome is a premium on your grain, and that's market driven. So it's really exciting. And if you think about it from the consumer's point of view, to help conceptualize it, 1 pound of climate-friendly rice uses over 60 gallons less water in a given year than conventionally grown rice. And so I don't know if you've ever taken a bath and thought this, where you're like, man, this is a lot of water. A 2-pound bag of climate-friendly rice at the grocery store is basically 4 bathtubs less water than a 2-pound bag of conventionally grown. And being able to bring that to the consumer and allowing them to selectively purchase based on that water saving, which goes all the way back to the farmer on the ground, is just a really exciting change in the industry where now consumers can say, I can consciously select the rice that I'm purchasing and I know the environmental benefit associated with it. So that's kind of the holistic supply chain view and how it's going all the way to the end consumer.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. they can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
That is exciting, and I agree. I don't typically think in terms of how many bathtubs something is, but that's a good new framework. But if I understand correctly, if we even just think at conventional carbon credits, there's a pretty long, lengthy process for those credits to be, let's say, packaged and then monetized, and then the value returned to the person that ultimately was the source of that credit.
Yeah,
that's exactly something you guys are running up against as well?
Yeah, so we started our first carbon project development. So you would characterize AgriCapture as a project developer. So that was the end of 2020. Our first issuance of carbon credits was not until September of 2022. And then now our second issuance of carbon credits is happening next month. So we've basically gone from a 2-year development period where it's kind of farmer harvests their crop and 2 years later we're issued credits, now to just over a year. And then we forecast that our third verification will actually happen later this year for the 2023 crop. So the duration between implementation of practice to dollars in the bank account is getting shorter and shorter. And that's because just efficiencies in the industry with verifiers, with registries, with AgriCapture's ability to aggregate and model data. And so, the immediacy of the financial incentive is getting closer and closer to the implementation of the practice.
And I'm guessing that is expected or projected to drive wider adoption, because a 2-year, 24-month, or an 18-month delay with an uncertain outcome.
Right.
It's not even like it's guaranteed that in 18 months a check's going to come in the mail. I'm guessing that must just weigh on the farmer perspective around the relative value and their belief that they can actually monetize this. So is that are you expecting a spike in adoption then? Is that something that's sort of capping the market at this time? And once you solve for that, it could really rip?
Yeah, I'm sure you can imagine saying, hey, if you implement this practice now, in 2 years, you might get an undetermined financial reward for it, is not a super compelling value proposition. Now that we have a corpus of data that allows us to accurately forecast what the carbon credit yield will be per acre, and also relationships with buyers to get a better sense of price per credit. And the duration has gone from 2 years to a couple of months. It's no longer, would you consider implementing this practice and maybe getting a payment in 2 years? It's becoming, if you implement this practice, spring of 24, we expect you to get paid X dollars per acre by spring of 25. So that is very much supporting adoption. I think that, in tandem with the farmers that initially enrolled in our program in a peer-to-peer network, can say, I enrolled and I actually did get paid, which I don't think has been seen to date. And so it's farmers being able to say, yep, I actually got paid, in addition to it's the lag time between payments is coming down every year.
Yeah, so that social proof is going to be an accelerant. You talked about the overall schedule or timing to package, verify, sell, and then compensate against these credits is getting shorter and shorter. Is the benefit of those efficiencies evenly distributed across anybody that wants to participate in this marketplace, or does it really accrue to outfits like AgriCapture that have been doing it ahead of time? And I guess maybe a different way of asking that is, you talked about this corpus of data and the ability to more accurately predict what the financial reward might be. Is that exclusive to you, or do the benefits of efficiency sort of become available to everybody that wants to get into the game now?
Yeah, let me answer that with an example. So this past year, we soil sampled something like 30,000 acres, right? And when you want to soil sample to understand soil organic carbon, bulk density of carbon, pH value, and clay content, you need to get a healthy set of samples to have a good understanding of what the landscape looks like in terms of those variables. But then as you grow, your sample rate per unit area, right? The amount of samples you need to take to have a strong understanding of those variables as you expand acreage goes down. And that's through things like machine learning and having a set of data and proxies to be able to determine. And so, long way to say, the efficiencies are being gained by virtue of building data sets that drive better understandings and reduce uncertainty. Uncertainty is a big piece of the puzzle because you're modeling emissions. We don't have flux towers over every single field. And so the more data you have and the more information available, the lower the uncertainty, which means the higher the credit value, because absent that, you're actually taking deductions on your credits on the basis of uncertainty.
Interesting. Additionally, on the adoption side,
Joe, I might have lost half your viewers with the whole uncertainty deduction discussion.
Well, so we have 0 viewers, but we may have lost some listeners, but I doubt it. So, and forgive me for not knowing a lot about rice as an agricultural product, but I know one of the, let's say, historical pushbacks against a move into organic farming, right? Organic soybeans for a long time has held a pretty steady premium over conventional. But there's always that calculus of, is there a yield loss? And net of that yield loss, is there still enough incremental value to justify converting a field into organic acreage?
Yeah.
Now, I know this is not apples to apples. We're talking about something different here. But do some of the regenerative practices that are required for either the offsets or the insets we're talking about here in rice, do they have a downward or negative impact on the productive capacity of those acres? If so, is that also an adoption headwind? Or are you guys actually able to help people see past that and it continues to be an attractive change?
Yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, there's so many variables, even beyond just yield. But let me address that variable first. So the primary practices to reduce emissions and save water in rice is alternate wetting and drying and furrow irrigated rice. Both of those do not have yield lags. So you're able to use less water and have less methane emissions, but still maintain yields relative to a conventionally flooded field. What I think you're alluding to, and is really important to us, is looking at these impacts relative to yield, not necessarily per acre. So if you look at how much water you use and how much methane you emit per pound of rice that you produce, you'd be surprised that because organic has a significant yield decline, it actually has the highest water usage and methane emissions per pound of rice produced. Whereas conventional has higher yield, so therefore the water usage and methane emissions per pound are lower than organic. And then because climate-friendly rice can maintain yield but drastically reduce methane and water use, the water reductions and methane reductions per pound of rice are massive. And so all that to say, we know how sensitive of a variable yield is. So we tend to just focus on practices that farmers can profitably implement and maintain yield, but also have associated environmental benefits.
Fantastic. Thanks for continuing to field these questions here. And there's lots of directions we can go here, but you know, when we met earlier, or actually I guess it was late last year, one of the things that you talked about, I'm not asking you to name your competitors, but you did comment that there are relatively few companies that have been able to successfully bring a carbon credit project all the way through to fruition. And I'm talking about counting on one hand.
Right.
The number of companies, I think, is what you...
You only need 2 fingers, actually.
You only need 2 fingers, and AgriCapture is one of them. So we won't ask you to name the counterparty, but this is very recent here. We're recording in late January, but I read an article earlier this week about Organic Valley, which, of course, is a member co-op, and they have announced that they've created their own credit program. So they're going to be not just creating the products, creating the carbon market effectively for their membership, but also looking to support their members in implementing regenerative practices, providing technical assistance, providing some sort of funding to support that. My speculation here is that this kind of move is predicated upon some of the efficiencies and progress that they've seen from some of the successful companies that are creating these projects. Does the proliferation of additional companies creating these successful projects and issuing credits and being able to create a market for this, so moving from an idea to an actual functioning market, is that something you expect? Do you foresee this accelerating? I'm not asking you to speak to organic value specifically, but is that something that is on sort of the competitive roadmap of what AgriCapture thinks they're going to need to navigate in the years ahead?
Yeah, I think we'll see more of it. And frankly, it's really exciting. If you think about farmers are implementing a practice that creates an environmental asset, if you will. You've either reduced a ton of emissions or sequestered a ton of carbon. So you're creating that asset. In the example of Organic Valley, they've already basically come out and said, well, we'll pay for that asset, right? We'll work with our producers to implement these practices. And then based on the outcome, we are effectively purchasing that environmental asset. And so very similar to what we're doing in offsets, right? Which is we're working with farmers to implement these practices. We're quantifying the outcome, but then we're selling it to an open market outside the value chain. And so I think you'll see, frankly, both happen. You'll have, some Fortune 500 companies or co-ops doing it internally, saying, let's implement these practices, we'll quantify the outcomes, and we'll pay you for that impact. And then you'll have some companies that, frankly, that's just not where they want to put their money in. So for those growers, those producers, those farmers, you still want them to implement these practices and achieve these outcomes, but then that asset will leave the value chain and go offset a company's carbon footprint, or you name it. And so I think you'll see both. From AgriCapture's perspective, we know how hard it is to do this in a robust way. We know how hard it is to capture the data. We know how hard it is to interface with these farmers and understand the agronomic practices and realize the outcome that allows payments to flow. And so we actually believe that as more companies set up these insetting initiatives, which is what you could probably characterize what Organic Value is doing, is that there's a great opportunity for AgriCapture to help facilitate that, because we have such a deep understanding of the data, of the practices, and of the quantification.
So you may actually see the folks that, let's say for the moment that Organic Valley struggles in administering the program at scale. That could become an argument for companies like AgriCapture becoming expert service providers, market makers that support a variety of different companies that actually do want to create something that's somewhat captive for their membership if they're a co-op, or if they've got a loyal producer base that's, that they're originating grain from or whatever it is. There's still an opportunity to play there, should they struggle.
That's right. And I think as you see more like SEC regulations come into the claims that you're making around your scope 3 emissions, or FTC talking about what you can make claims based on, I think the bar for quality of data and proof of practice will continue to go up. And so I would say you want to be ahead of that, right? You need it to be rigorous, because even if, people have characterized the carbon markets as the Wild West for a while now, and that's true, but the bar continues to be raised, and you want to be ahead of that in terms of quality of data and rigor behind what you're claiming on your scope 3 emissions to your investors, on your packaging. And so all that to say, we think we're in a great position to be able to support those things, particularly as the level of rigor continues to be raised and scrutiny.
So yeah, I think that's valid. As you're talking, this show we really talk about strategy execution, right? And how do folks take an idea, whether it's a novel solution, product or service, an unmet need in the marketplace, whatever the big idea is, and how do they actually execute and pull it off? And as I think about AgriCapture, I think about what you've been sharing here today, this is a very, like to your point, it's a very complex technical problem, with some of it that is regulatory in nature, some of it is administrative in nature, some of it is, data collection and management, some of it's just administrative. How do you ensure that you have the processes in place to be able to do it right and then repeatedly do it right at scale? Mm-hmm. And there's lots of people out there that have to sell incredibly technically complex solutions, right? If you buy an iPhone, you're buying the solution to a series of very challenging technical problems. but the education requirements for you as the consumer are relatively low, meaning you've trusted the company has solved all the problems. Now you're going to exchange money for that product, and now you're going to benefit from that solution. What I think I'm hearing here, though, is that you have the dual challenge of it's an incredibly technically complex and difficult thing to pull off, but you also have to educate your customer on it. So they don't necessarily get off the hook, right? They don't benefit 100% from you guys mastering the process. They still have to participate. And so I guess my question is, how do you tackle that challenge of investing in one being leading class at executing these projects, simplifying it as much as possible for the counterparties, but then also educating them because they have very real and burdensome requirements that they're signing up for. I mean, what has that journey been like? What have you learned? Just would love to kind of get your insights there as someone who's been really helping to bring this thing, again, take an emerging market and idea and bring it into a functioning capacity.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think AgriCapture, part of our value is understanding the nuts and the bolts and the nitty gritty, very complex issues, but then being able to distill it down to the producer as if you do X, you can receive Y, right? And let be a tool in their toolkit as they operate their land and make decisions, right? And then on the other end, to the consumer saying, this bag of rice saves 60 gallons of water, right? And in the middle is a tremendous amount of complexity and additionality and permanence and data and modeling and verification. And we have to go through verification by 2 or 3 different entities every single year. And so in the middle of those two things is just a tremendous amount of data and work and complexity. But on the front end, making it very simple and an easily interpretable decision-making factor. And on the back end for the consumer, distilling it all down into, well, what does this mean? How is it better for me? And how is it better for the environment, right? And in between is kind of where we operate.
Yeah, it's so as I was explaining what I thought was a pretty complex challenge, you just doubled down on the communication aspect of it. Is you're trying to package it for 2 entirely different sort of customer profiles, if you will.
Right.
The people you're selling the service to and the people that are then going to pay a premium reflective of the benefit of that service. Yeah, I imagine that's an ongoing challenge.
Yeah. There's great examples of success. I mean, organic has achieved that, right? And so that's a great, case study for the practices being implemented in the market, being willing to pay. And then also, frankly, like some of these leaders in the carbon offset world, really understanding the complexities of being able to discern what is a high quality carbon credit, what is a true, where is true impact being created, and then paying for that. So, we've had really good partners understanding the complexities with us and then coming along with us to create that market.
So as we kind of look towards the end of our time here today, let's look forward. And I guess this is, to the extent if we have not covered this already today, what do you think the American farmer, whether they're in a specialty crop, whether they're in rice or cotton, whether they're in a sort of conventional row crop space, wherever they are, what do they need to be thinking about? And when I say that, it's really twofold. What opportunities should they be pursuing now or thinking very strongly about pursuing? And what are those emerging trends or opportunities that you would encourage them to be keeping an eye on?
Yeah, I would say what you'll see, I believe, is more differentiation based on the way that crops are produced, right? So I would encourage farmers to think about how can they add value to their crop. And that could be quality of the grain. It could be quality of whatever they're producing. It could also be how much water did I use, how much fertilizer or otherwise, because we're seeing now that the market is ascribing value to that information. So the farmers add value to the crop, and then AgriCapture unlocks that value via data and creating an asset to sell to the market. And so there's a little piece in between those two that's important for farmers to be aware of, which is data is very important and data has value. And so as you are doing these things to improve your land or to reduce inputs and maintain outputs, managing your data and tracking it is where a lot of the value comes from. And you would be in a good position to begin monitoring those things now so that you can work with companies to be able to monetize it either this year, next year, into the future.
Fantastic. And I think also kind of teasing out something you said earlier too, traditionally in a lot of these markets, there's been the idea, and I mentioned it earlier, that you only get compensated for new behaviors, right? For folks that have always been rotating and no-till farming and looking to reduce or put very little chemicals onto their fields, et cetera. Whatever that practice may be, that has traditionally been a barrier, meaning if you already had those practices in place, you were largely shut out from this market that incentivized incremental
gains,
new, different behavior. Whereas now, a company like AgriCapture can actually be an advisor and a partner in helping you monetize your existing good behaviors in the form of a premium on the product or the value chain it goes into, or an inset. Yes.
Yeah, because when a company switches their supply shed from a farmer that's maybe not doing the same practices to a farmer who has been doing them, even if they've been doing them for decades, that has switched their scope 3 emissions. It's reduced the footprint of their supply chain. And so even if you've been doing it for decades, you need to be able to quantify basically the benefit of what you're producing and be compensated for it. And that's where insets play a really important role. And so, AgriCapture views these three as kind of the three-headed dragon, which is carbon offsets for new practices, carbon insets, which is irrespective of new practices. Let's monetize the value creation and pass it downstream for scope 3 reporting. And then crop premiums for those that are really getting a segregated product, not commingled, not mass balanced, but into the consumer's hands, and help them understand that they are supporting these practices that are happening on the ground.
Fantastic. Love it. Well, Tyler, thank you for the primer on carbon credits, offsets, insets, the market, and all of your insights as someone who's leading a lot of innovation in this space. I think what you guys are doing is incredibly exciting. You're among a critical few that are doing this and finding success. And I think that's noteworthy. And so I'm really happy we had the chance to have you on the show. And it's not a topic, again, that we talk very much about. But given that you're way out at the edge creating the products and solutions and helping create value in this emerging marketplace, I think it just provides some really unique insights into how to think about executing strategy and this dual challenge of solving the technical complexity and then also trying to figure out how do you articulate the relative simplicity to the different people that are going to participate, whether they're helping you create the product or ultimately are buying the product. It was great having you on the show. How do our listeners learn more about AgriCapture? Where can they learn more? Where can they find you guys? And if they want to, how do they get in touch with you directly?
Yeah, so you can go to agricapture.com or feel free to email me directly. My email is thull@agricapture.com. Yeah, we're really excited. And the only thing I would amend is that we really believe that the farmer is creating the value. We're just helping them unlock it. And so would be happy to get to know more farmers, supply chain players, corporations, really just trying to create that service for the industry.
Fantastic. Great clarification. Love it. Well, thank you again for being part of the Pacesetter Pod today. And to our listeners, thank you as always for tuning in. Remember to like and subscribe to the Pacesetter Pod wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find and follow me, Joe Mosier, on LinkedIn, or visit us online at mosiercg.com to set up a call and let's talk. Safe, sustainable, and profitable execution to you all. Thank you for the work that you do for our industry. We'll catch you next time.
This is the podcastfactory.com.